Thank you, Asif, and thank you for hosting me today. I think your introduction was spot on. I'm going to just add a little bit more detail to it. So I was born and raised in the San Gabriel Valley in Southern California near Pasadena. I moved to the Bay Area in Northern California to attend school and have lived there for the most part ever since. I'm married and we've got a 2-year-old and a 16-year-old. On the professional side, I have been associated with IT projects for my entire career. I started as a business analyst. I configured SAP for several years. And then I transitioned into project management and then into change management. And the reason I went into change management was that I noticed that there were a lot of successes that we had, technically speaking, but there were always some predictable challenges that were people related that I felt if we could address those, we'd really maximize our value and just simply get better adoption for whatever implementation we were talking about. I joined ExpressWorks, which is a change management focused consulting firm, in 2004, and was invited to play a change management and communications role on SharePoint 2007 implementation a few years later that was rolling out to a 60,000 user base globally, and was invited to participate in a subsequent upgrade to SharePoint 2010. And it was out of those efforts that we developed the SharePoint adoption practice at ExpressWorks. So you may ask why an org change firm might develop a practice like this, and it was really because while we were involved in these efforts, we kind of had an aha moment, which was that SharePoint adoption is no different from any other change initiative. You still need somebody who can give clear guidance on where you're headed, what the benefits are for the organization and for your group and for the people involved. You still need somebody to identify the behaviors you're looking for and make sure that there are people there who are role modeling and reinforcing those behaviors. And finally, there's truly some heavy lifting involved. In change efforts, you can't just use hope as a strategy. You actually have to build a people-oriented plan that sits alongside and is interwoven with your technology plan. And the people-oriented plan helps you focus on setting the vision, preparing people to make the change, and ensuring that that change is sustained, and in the case of SharePoint adoption, of course, that it grows. So we know that these are the requirements for any change initiative, and yet we still see companies struggling to grow their SharePoint adoption. So we asked them to identify the areas where they were struggling, and we found several themes, and I'm sharing just a few of those common themes now, and you may recognize some of these, and you probably have some to add to this list. But let me just walk through. So the first theme is that people seem to think that somehow SharePoint is magic and that it will automatically solve collaboration or information management challenges that the company has. And usually that the challenge is around, hey, I can't find the information I need to be able to complete my work. But we know that it's really not magic. Another theme is that while project budgets are usually sized correctly, they can usually be predicted based on all of the experience that's out there in the market already. Companies don't seem to be prepared for that ongoing investment that's required to help support SharePoint and build adoption and nurture the community that develops around SharePoint. And because SharePoint is an ever-evolving platform, and if the vision is that more and more business gets conducted on SharePoint, by extension, you need the people who know how to manage the sites, provide permission, access, do configuration changes. Another theme that we've seen is focused on the balance between too much or too little governance. And one way or the other actually can stifle innovation. If your governance processes are too stringent and there's a pressing business need that calls for a technology solution, people will find a way to solve that need with or without SharePoint. So if you're standing in the way, you're being a hindrance, you're not helping. And if there's too little governance, then people might actually be developing capabilities that end up being developed over and over because nobody has visibility to what's being done. And either way, you risk losing the power of collaborative and incremental innovation. And then the final theme that I included is a little bit different from the other themes, but it seems to be no less prevalent, or just as prevalent. And it stems from how people are used to storing documents. And I suspect that many of you are nodding your heads in agreement right now, because this is one of the ones that just keeps coming up over and over. If you transition a shared drive's worth of content and just start accessing it using SharePoint as a front end, you lose a lot of the power of what SharePoint brings, because it has such power in using it more like a database. And if you're looking for more collaborative behavior and different ways of thinking, allowing people to continue using the same behavior likely just perpetuates that behavior. You don't get the change that you're looking for. So we know what the conditions are for good adoption. We know that there's still these challenges and others. So what can you do? In today's webinar, I'm going to cover 10 behavior change management techniques and processes that can help you address these and other SharePoint adoption challenges. I do want to get through the 10 techniques first, and then I'll answer questions at the end. I want to make sure to get all the content out there first, but I'm sensitive to making sure that we leave time at the end to answer questions. As I describe each technique, I'm also going to be showing some screenshots of a tool that we use to help facilitate the change management process. It's a fairly straightforward tool. It's built in SharePoint, and I'm hoping that one of your key takeaways today is that change management doesn't have to be complex or mysterious, just that it requires some effort. So the first step is to identify your sponsor and your stakeholders. And a sponsor is somebody who offers the vision for how you're going to use SharePoint and provides the resources to fund the effort. And when I say resources, I'm referring to the money, people, hardware, and even in a sense mind share, so prioritization and visibility to people that this is something that you're pursuing. Stakeholders are the people who are either impacted by or who can influence the success of the effort. And it's an important distinction, because I often hear people refer to stakeholders, and I think they're actually talking about end users. But depending on how you're rolling out SharePoint or any initiative, you could be impacting business partners like your customers or suppliers. And in that case, it's not only advantageous, but it's critical to include them when you're building your business case and developing the design and rolling out the capability. They need to be on board and understanding and supportive of what you're doing, especially if it impacts them or if they can influence the success. Once you've identified your stakeholders, then you can begin to engage them. And you might not engage all stakeholders at first, but before you set any kind of plan in place, you need to work with stakeholders to validate that plan. And I want to make a point about engagement. We talk about engagement, we use that word oftentimes to mean we're having a meeting or we're communicating with somebody. And my point is that engagement does not equal communication. This man here is communicating, but he's not necessarily being heard or understood, although I think I can hear him shouting off the page practically. And he's almost certainly not getting true engagement. True engagement results in enrollment, meaning agreeing to the role that you need to play in the initiative to achieve success. So engagement means understanding what the vision is, understanding why now, and then identifying and being able to cross or remove the barriers that might be in the way to achieving the vision. And that's the extra mile that change management can bring. It's doing more than just delivering information. It's truly shaping an initiative in a way that minimizes any barriers and maximizes the adoption. So I want to share an example with you here of how to engage, in this case, a sponsor, to help him or her understand their role and how to fulfill their role. And you can see that this is an actual example that we pulled from one of our clients, and it has the obvious candidates, like make sure to communicate what your vision and expectations are, make sure to promote success stories about the rollout. But it also includes some specific items that were missing in that particular environment. So endorsing new proposed power user roles. We wanted to have an explicit spot on an org chart to have power users so that there were written roles and responsibilities and people were named to those spots so that they were a recognized part of the structure. We also asked this particular sponsor to take an active role in defining how he and his team would use SharePoint. And there were two reasons for that. One was so that he was role modeling the behavior for others, and the second reason was so that he got the experience himself to understand what it took to build a community and a team around using SharePoint. So just walking through this very simple list of bullets helped us establish the clarity and the mutual expectations that we needed to achieve success. The third step is building a vision and developing a business case. I put this quote here. I once had a professor who said this, that if you don't know where you're going, any road can take you there. And it makes sense. Just imagine a simple example of going on summer vacation. If you pack up the car and just point it north or south or whichever direction, and you end up at the beach, then you discover that you're disappointed that you've arrived at the beach and you haven't arrived in the mountains. If you had set a quick vision before you left, for example, maybe this summer your intention is to overcome your fear of mountain biking. Well, then you may have pointed your car in the opposite direction, put a bike on the back of it, and headed up to take on that vision. Now, when I say the word vision, I think some people bristle a little bit. Setting a vision doesn't require hours of deliberation, and it doesn't require developing some kind of super tight statement that is wordsmithed by a room full of consultants in the middle of the night. It could just simply mean imagining yourself at some point in the future and answering a handful of questions about what that future world looks like or feels like. Here are some questions that we've started with to help guide people in developing their own vision statements. So again, imagine yourself at 3 years in the future, for example, or 2 years, or whatever your timeline is. What capabilities are people using? What business processes are being enabled? What's it like for people to use SharePoint? And if you're looking back, were there interim milestones that let you know that you were making progress along the way? And then we use this type of question and answer panel to just establish that this is the vision. You don't have to take this now and painstakingly summarize it and make sure that you've got really well crafted, 2 or 3 sentences that you put on posters around the wall. This in and of itself should serve as enough clarity for people who are trying to understand what are we trying to achieve. The next step involves developing the business case, and a business case generally has 3 parts. What can increase revenue? What can reduce costs? And what are the qualitative or strategic benefits? And depending on how you plan to use SharePoint, any or all of these may be relevant. I do want to make 2 points about the business case development. One is be really cautious in using any argument that relies on a minutes saved per day calculation to develop cost savings. So if you were to say, I'm going to have 20,000 people save 2 minutes per day, and therefore that translates into X dollars because of the fully loaded cost. These arguments don't tend to be credible with executives unless they result in substantial enough time savings that people actually wholesale turn their attention to some other activity, or unless they result in a real headcount reduction. The other caution I would give is don't perform mental gymnastics to calculate a positive return on investment if there isn't one, because sometimes there isn't one. I was on a project once that justified a significant investment simply on the virtue of it being an operating necessity. And so imagine all the time and effort that we avoided, as well as the lack of credibility of a business case that we had really manufactured to try to justify something when at its heart we knew it was simply operating necessity. So that's something that if it stands on its own merits, it could go forward. The fourth step is to identify measures that are tied to that business case that help you monitor that you're making progress toward achieving the benefits that you anticipated. So as an example, if your vision is that you're going to use SharePoint to increase engagement with customers, and the expectation is that this will result in larger orders coming in from those customers, then a logical measure would be the average order size per customer. And you could measure that prior to implementation and post-implementation and track that on a graph and see, did we increase as much as we expected? Did we stay the same? If your vision instead is something a little bit more qualitative, like improving workforce collaboration, then it may be relevant to ask users to respond to surveys and have them measure on a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 10 what they perceive the level of collaboration to be. And again, if you do this before and after an implementation, you can see quantified and for a qualitative measure how that perception has changed over time. One caution with measures is don't have too many. Just like a car dashboard really only shows you a few things, and it puts front and center and the biggest gauge that's the most important right in front of you. If you stray and have too many measures, you'll forget the things that drove you to use SharePoint in the first place. The next step is to identify barriers to adoption as well as enablers. And let me talk about barriers first. I think that's more natural for us to consider. We're used to thinking of negative resistance to change. Barriers can be systemic, such as there not being any people in SharePoint support positions, or even not having support positions defined on an org chart. Or they could be temporary, such as there being competing priorities, and maybe there are people who are working on other projects who you'd really like to pry loose to participate on your project, and that it is those people who would help make it a success. Now think of enablers, and this is something that, again, I don't think people consider much, but these could be just as powerful in terms of achieving success. And the example I'm going to use is this first one here that talks about a senior leader having had success with SharePoint. I was in a project team where one of the senior leaders had come from another part of the organization, and he had had a really good experience using SharePoint with his group, and he wanted to replicate that success. And so when we learned of that, we thought about, okay, how might we take advantage of that to help influence others and improve our adoption? And that leads me to the next technique, which is quantifying and managing those barriers and enablers. You may recognize this. This is an example of where change management and project management intersect and work together to get that extra boost in business value. The chart you're seeing here is the same as is used in risk identification and measurement and quantification. But here what I've done is I've built on this question of, or this situation where we've got somebody who had previous success in SharePoint, and I just asked a few questions. So what might the impact be if we ask this person to describe his experience to others? And what specifically could we do to actually encourage him to do that? And then how valuable is focusing on that relative to either managing other risks or cultivating other opportunities, so that we know where to put our resources when we're starting the influence phase of the project, which is throughout the entire project. So applying a little bit more effort and rigor to this statement that up until now sounded very intangible. It sounds very intangible to say, hey, I used SharePoint before and it was cool. Oh, how can we, let's dig into that and see if and how we can use that. And now this becomes something tangible. And the actions that are listed here are things that you can convert into tasks on a work plan with timing and an assigned to person. And so you can be really deliberate about moving the adoption along rather than just saying, generally speaking, that this other person had a good experience and leaving it at that. Another technique is to frequently assess your readiness for change. And I think we often associate this step with something that you do just prior to a rollout or go live. But it's important that you have a sense for readiness early on. And when I say early on, I mean right at the beginning. And the reason is, if you know at the very beginning of your project how ready you are or that you're going to be by the time you get to go live, then you're in an advantageous position to be able to identify the activities that go on your work plan that can move you from a state of not readiness or not quite ready to fully ready. We use a tool that looks at 8 critical success factors, and that this is based on original research that we've done and highlights what are typically people-oriented factors in improving success of any type of project. And then we look at those 8 factors across 3 phases to determine what constitutes readiness, and then we say, where are we now? And in this example, we've used a simple scoring technique to assign a current value. The current state value in this case is 22 out of a desired state of 27, and that probably doesn't mean anything on an absolute basis. This is really a relative measure. But in our tool, this means we can proceed, but proceed with caution. And this is one of the tools that I definitely want to show after I'm done with the PowerPoint presentation. One thing to think about here, these milestones and measures that we've set for ourselves here are things that we've defined, and we've said in our situation for phase 1 what constitutes very high readiness in each of these 8 critical success factors is something that we own, meaning the project owns. So you need to establish these for yourselves. We've got a starting point, but if you say that very high readiness means that we've got a general understanding of where we're headed, fine. Also be very honest about where you are currently. This is one of those areas where I wish I could claim that getting a yellow or a red in a people-oriented measure has actually prevented us from moving from one phase to another or prevented us from going live. But the reality is, the only thing I've ever seen is that usually a technical measure is something that extends a phase or moves a go live date. So the way we look at this is more about the risk that you're assuming by moving forward. So if we say we're at a yellow state, as long as we know where those yellow pockets are, is it a matter of we haven't communicated? Is it a matter of we don't have the measurements in place yet? Then we know what holes or what gaps we need to fill in order to be ready as we move into the next phase. I want to talk about a couple of specific change management deliverables. The first is the organizational capability plan. And for this plan, we first consider the groups who are impacted or involved, and our model starts with these 4 groups here on the left. And you may, in your environment, have additional groups, or you may want to refine this list. Maybe it doesn't fit your situation exactly. But it tends to be a good starting point to consider anybody who might be involved or impacted in the effort. And then when we talk about developing capability, we mean more than just training. So we also want to know truly what is the organizational capability or capacity to be able to take on this challenge and to grow SharePoint adoption. So we want to consider whether the processes are consistent with the vision, that people know what their roles and responsibilities are in achieving or executing those processes, that sponsors and champions have the tools they need to be good leaders of this effort. And then on an ongoing basis, there needs to be a deliberate focus on recognizing and rewarding the behaviors you're looking for, and to make sure that there's a culture of continual learning. I made the point earlier that SharePoint is an ever-developing platform, and given that nature, that evergreen nature of the tool, people really need to be able to keep up with what's happening. That said, it's also such a it's also got such a lot of capability that you could probably continue to take advantage of things that have been available for years. So if we think about the various aspects of capability development and align those or assign those to the various roles that are involved, then we can develop a more comprehensive organizational capability plan, and one that considers the system as a whole. And when I say system here, I'm talking about that traditional people, process, and technology, and how all of those work together to deliver value. So this is really a framework. If you were to imagine this grid without the content in the middle for a second, now you've got something that you're compelled to want to fill in. And so the way I would do this is take each column one at a time and ask myself, for example, in the area of awareness and training, what do I need to do for end users? And in this case, I said, let's make sure to develop a training and communications plan that delivers more information as you move closer to go live. For power users, I might need to get them involved earlier on in the process and be part of testing so that they learn the capability more and more thoroughly and are prepared to support the end users when they start to get involved. Support personnel may need advanced training and configuration, and sponsors might benefit from a short workshop that in which we review the capabilities so they know what the possibilities are, and they can identify and recognize where SharePoint may fill a business need that they have had but they didn't know SharePoint could address. So then you would do the same exercise with each of the next 3 columns. And you may decide that some spaces aren't relevant. So for example, it probably doesn't make sense to pursue leadership development strategies for end users when it comes to SharePoint adoption. But it might make sense to pursue them for power users. because we need power users to be positive sponsors and champions for the platform, as well as to encourage end users to learn more and do more on the system. What is important, though, is if you've thought through this whole framework, then you've got a basis for a much more thorough and rich experience. And now you've got a situation where you have tangible activities that you can take from this and lift and place directly in a work plan. The next deliverable is a governance model, and this is something that you may recognize from what Microsoft actually published several years ago as they were first rolling out SharePoint. And the governance model is not something that writes the rules of the road for you, but it helps you prioritize exactly how you might think about and organize the sites in your platform. So this model segments the sites first into the sites that are assigned on a one per person basis. So at the bottom of the model, you'll see OneDrive or My Sites, depending on the version of the platform that you're on. And then at the very top of the model are the sites that are assigned just one per organization. And through the various levels of the pyramid are the different levels of the organization are represented in terms of how they might be assigned to SharePoint sites. And then reading from the bottom of the pyramid up, the sites at the bottom of the pyramid generally require less governance. So for example, you probably don't have a governance or a publication approval process to put something out on OneDrive. But you would have an approval process to post something to the company portal as an official communication. Then surrounding the entire model are the elements that are common to all sites. You may have consistent corporate branding that you want to apply to all sites regardless of the level of governance or approval required. You may have an enterprise information architecture that you want to use globally and that pervades all sites. And then underlying the whole system, you may have policies in place and best practices that help inform how SharePoint is used. So then you can use this model, as I said, to prioritize where you need to write the governance and where only a simple few rules are needed. And this model is really helpful, I think, in talking to the people who are at extreme ends of the governance opinion scale, I guess I would say. So those who think SharePoint ought to be completely free, you may want to talk to them about there are some areas where we need to be a little bit more restrictive. And then I think far more than that, I've seen a lot of people who feel that SharePoint ought to be very locked down, when in reality, again, that stifles that innovation, and people are going to get their work done regardless of whether they're using SharePoint. So let's open up some portions of it, have it be a little bit more free-flowing, and now you've got an ecosystem that leverages both the innovative capabilities as well as has the more formal capabilities. Finally, I recommend that you use a methodology that combines both the technical and the people-related activities. That way you know you're making progress in both of those strains simultaneously, and you can avoid those predictable mistakes that I talked about at the opening that I kept encountering. So I'm going to take this opportunity now to drill down into the methodology as well as to show you the tool that I was referring to. So this methodology has 3 phases. The first is to frame or structure the project or the challenge. The second phase is around developing all of the plans that you need to achieve the vision. And then finally, the third phase is around deploying and executing all of those plans. So when I expand each of these phases, you'll probably recognize some of the steps that I mentioned earlier in the presentation. If we drill into the dashboard of any given phase, so I'll just go into phase 1 here, we can see the key components of that phase all in one location. And this gives us the ability to view those key components and make changes as we need to. So as an example, in phase 1, the vision, of course, is a key component, and you'll recognize this from the presentation. I just copied it directly into there. So if you need a quick reminder on the vision, here's the panel with that information. And then if I need to make an update, I can just open up the vision statement, provide more information, and then save it back. Well, we're being a little slow today, apparently. There we go. And here I've captured that information. It's right here again in the panel, and anybody who has access to the tool can now see that the new information on the vision. So that was the phase 1 dashboard. When I go into the phase 2 dashboard, then the components that we highlight are a little bit different from when we highlighted in phase 1, just simply because this is what we're now really focusing on, and the information that we captured in phase 1 does flow to phase 2 to build upon. One of the key tools that we keep at hand in all of the phases, and this was one of the ones I mentioned earlier, is the readiness assessment. And so you'll recognize the current state, desired state of the readiness assessment. If we drill into the details of this tool, then what you'll see first is a dashboard that shows, now this was done for illustrative purposes. So we've already got an assessment as if we had completed phases 1, 2, and done an assessment for phase 3 as well. But this gives you a sense for each of the 8 critical success factors, where we are today and where we wanted to be by the end of that phase. And then scrolling further down, we've got our scale, which defines what constitutes red, yellow, green. And then I think this is where a lot of the secret sauce is, right here, is defining our assessment criteria for moving from phases 1 to 2 to 3, and what constitutes low, medium, high, and very high readiness in each of these phases. And you'll see we've defined, so for clear direction, we've defined that we would consider ourselves at very high readiness if all key stakeholders are aligned on the opportunity. Now, to be sure, that is a judgment call. But the way that we use this is that we ask the principal players involved to provide an assessment. Do they think all key stakeholders are aligned on the opportunity? Or do they think stakeholders have wildly different views on the vision and opportunity, which would define low readiness? And then the magic happens in the conversation that you have based on the fact that one person said we were at very high readiness and one person said we were at low readiness, then you get a good dialogue and alignment and an ability to identify what are the actions we might need to take to move forward. So these are the definitions in phase 1, and if you move to phase 2, you'll notice that the definitions have changed, because as we get closer to actual deployment and execution, we need to be at a full state of readiness, but you don't necessarily have to be at a full state of readiness on day 1. So that's why we can define different assessment criteria for each of the phases. So combining this project and change management tool together with our project document library, a risk register, communications plans, and other project collateral allows us to maintain an organized and professional project repository, but it also frees us to focus on adoption. And that was, again, our primary goal was to get good adoption. So I want to leave you with one final thought before I open it up to questions. And I know what people say about change management professionals, and I want to dispel a myth right here. And really, with just a little effort, change management can deliver measurable results. It doesn't have to be intangible. And the example here, this is taken from an actual client situation, and they were seeking improved collaboration across a global program team. And the irony here is that that team was responsible for integrating IT service delivery for a global organization around the world, but they themselves were siloed into 5 separate project teams, and each project team had its own SharePoint site that was none of them had access to the other, and they all used it much differently. So it was very, very difficult to interact and collaborate with one another. So they asked us to come in and improve how they used SharePoint, and their goal was to improve collaboration. So before we even started out on any redesign efforts, we asked what did they perceive their level of collaboration and their level of efficiency beforehand. And so you'll see this was the measure of where they felt they were in terms of collaboration behaviors before we made any change. They felt that mostly they seldom collaborated or they never collaborated. Then we worked with them to redesign, integrate the sites, and we spent a lot of effort talking to people about collaboration behaviors, and we posed some recommendations, but we encouraged the teams to have the conversation amongst themselves about what their rules of engagement or rules of the road would be in terms of working with one another. And that was so much more powerful. And they came up with about 10 or 15 explicit points about how they would agree to work together in SharePoint, and they also agreed that they would have somebody in a role to help them keep honest with those behaviors. So then after we deployed the design changes and had those conversations, we measured again. We sent out the same survey asking again, what did they feel their perception of the collaborative behavior as well as the efficiency? And you can see a marked improvement. The orange here represents where they were afterwards, that now they moved from seldom or never collaborating to always, or some said seldom, but it was a major shift overall. And 75% of the people who surveyed felt there was a significant improvement in efficiency. And we got some really cool quotes out of it as well. And What's even cooler is that the program manager used this chart to help justify keeping some resources engaged on the project to help support the site, reinforce the behavior, and continue to nurture that ongoing collaboration. So with that, I do want to open it up to questions. I've got one question here from Joel, who asks, one adoption issue relates to the ongoing changes in SharePoint and Office 365, like where should I put my stuff? OneDrive, team site libraries, group files, Yammer discussions. And thanks, Joel, I appreciate the question, and I agree. I think if you use a combination of these tools, and in particular the engagement process, you can address a lot of those open questions by having the group monitor itself. And then a governance model may also be helpful here in defining what is it that you want to encourage people to do. What other questions do people have? A question I'm often asked, this is Karen, a question I'm often asked is, what do we mean in our organization when we talk about collaboration? Is the one answer. A good question. This is why we used this measure that's on this slide about what did people perceive their level of collaboration to be, because it is a little bit personal sometimes. However, we do encourage that if you've got a sponsor who has a vision of improving collaboration, then that person or that set of people needs to be really explicit by what they mean. So in this particular case, we said collaboration was posting content to SharePoint as soon as you started to draft it, to not be afraid that somebody was going to make a judgment on something that wasn't ready, officially ready yet. We said collaboration was participating in the metadata assignment, because that was going to be a group or a sort of a social norm in terms of how people use SharePoint. We said collaboration was making sure that you sent links to people and not attachments, so that you were being open, if you will, about content rather than going around or the outside of a communication network and using email. Question from Jennifer about what time frame did this particular study cover. This was about 4 months that we did this study. Other questions?
Seems like you covered everything, Laura, in your presentation. There doesn't seem to be any more questions here.
Here's another question from Karen regarding business readiness. What's ready enough? IT is often it's often a balance of perception and confidence. And which do you advise? I hate to give the standard consulting answer, Karen, but it depends, and it really depends on what is your organization's tolerance for perception and confidence. I think the most important thing I would advise is establishing it well ahead of time and agreeing to the principles of what will constitute readiness, because there's so much pressure. And I've seen this. I'm managing a go no-go process for a project right now, And I know the pressure that you get in those last few weeks that you have to go live at the time that you said that you would. But there's also a resistance by some people because maybe the system isn't perfect enough yet. And we're talking now about perfection being the enemy of good enough. And having defined the criteria in a calm part of the project early on enough that where you have that confidence that once we get there, we're going to stick to these measures is all I can recommend. There's a question from Sasi of which is a better tool, online or on-premise. I think this is also another decision that's entirely up to the organization based on probably multiple selection criteria and the balance of how you want to have availability of content, security of content, the capability, the support processes, how many people do you have allocated or available to manage it. Chris asks, do you have any suggestions on how to get people away from folders? We try to encourage people to use metadata that allows for filters. One trick is I've seen, even though people move content over into folders, actually there's two things I can think of. One is to just disable the ability to create folders. Now, of course, that relies on a library by library assignment, and it relies on somebody, a power user, who is willing to do that, and it's very hard to not cave to the pressure. And then the other idea is to, even if content is stored in folders, to try to expose default views that don't show content in folders, and that sort of gets people used to it. Nevertheless, the underlying content is still sitting in folders. And so we just show people how it can be beneficial. I'm on another project now where we're the default view is grouped by certain metadata, and I show people that my default view is just a flat structure and why I do that. Karen asks if there are any coping mechanisms to cope and hold your nerve at the point of pressure to go live, even though readiness is not quite there. Boy, I'm not sure of coping mechanisms, but definitely that having defined your criteria well enough in advance and getting the support and maybe even going through some scenario or role play before you get there to say, what would we do if a certain situation comes up, then that would help. And the only other thing I can recommend is, in the end, this is all just work.